What is the relationship between authoritarianism, religion, and secularism? Or put another way, in the world right now, who's most likely to support authoritarian dictators, fascist tyrants? Is it the religious or the secular? That's what we're going to look at today. My name is Phil Zuckerman. I'm a professor of sociology and secular studies at the Claremont colleges, and I'm the author of several books, most recently Beyond Doubt, Society Without God, What It Means to Be Moral, and so on. So let's get into today's topic. Authoritarianism and dictators, religion, secularism. What's the dynamic at play out in the real world? There's a lot to be worried about right now on planet Earth, and I will not list all the things that threaten our existence. But I think a biggie right now is that democracy is really under attack all over the globe. This ideal of, government by the consent of the governed is relatively new in its implementation. It has its birth in philosophical thought going back thousands of years. But the idea that we actually have functioning democracies is a new and it seems precarious situation. It's also a secular ideal and a secular value. The notion that people ought to rule themselves is articulated in no holy scriptures, is never taught by any holy prophet or Messiah or God. It's something we came to on ourselves and have implemented on our own. But like I said, democracy's on the ropes right now all over the world. And we can start with the United States, right? With Trump's assault on our democratic institutions, our democratic norms, our democratic values, our laws. We've never seen anything like this before. Putin, what he's done over in the former Soviet Union, Russia, as an oligarch, as a dictator, as a tyrant. Modi and his nationalist Hinduism in India. What we saw recently with the attempted coup overthrow of the government in South Korea. Israel and the Netanyahu government occupied Palestine and Hamas, the Islamo-fascists there. Even down in South America, Bolsonaro. Yes, he just lost the last election, but he's a force to be reckoned with, and he has attempted to destroy democracy in Brazil. We can also talk about places like Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Le Pen in France, in country after country after country around the world. Wannabe dictators, rising authoritarians and autocrats are on the ascendancy, and it's a scary time. So the question I have as a social scientist is, where do religious and secular people fall? And what's interesting is all the people I just mentioned, from Bolsonaro to Putin to Netanyahu to Trump to Orban, you name it, while they all have their different flavors of ruling and their different styles, they do have one common bastion of support. In every society, it is the strongly religious within each respective society that is the most supportive of their anti-democratic movement and vision. And it is the most irreligious or secular that is the most opposed to authoritarianism and the most in support of holding on to our democratic system of government. That's a really interesting thing because it wasn't always the case. In fact, in the last century, some of the worst dictatorships on planet Earth were atheistic, certainly in orientation and often in terms of who supported them and how they worked. And even today, you have the situation in China, one of the worst dictatorships on planet Earth, that is atheistic. And yet, aside from those outliers, when we look at the world today, we see the same pattern over and over and over again. Here in the United States, it is always the most religious of just about every racial and ethnic group. African Americans are the one exception who are almost universally opposed to Trump. But aside from African Americans, among white populations, Protestant, Catholic, Latino, Hispanic, Asian American, the more religious, the more supportive they are of Trump's dictatorial efforts. Even among Jews, who are consistently in the United States voting Democrat, the most religious Jews, they love Trump. So this pattern, again, is consistent. So what's going on here? How do we explain it? And I think it's important because as a social scientist, I'm not engaged in philosophical debates about, what is the nature of God, or what is the ontological argument or the teleological argument. I'm kind of interested in how religion and secularism play out here on planet Earth. And there are many instances where a religious life produces all kinds of positive outcomes, benefits, advantages to secular life, no doubt about it. But in this question of democracy being under threat and under siege, it is without question that it's the strongly religious who are creating the most damage, the most harm, and ultimately the greatest amount of suffering. So why is this? How do we explain it? What's going on here? Well, in social sciences, we deal with averages, correlations, never absolutes. We see some relationships out there, and we try to see what's going on. So we know there's a strong relationship, and always has been, between religiosity and nationalism and militarism. Go figure. The stronger people are in their religious life, the more they tend to be nationalistic, and the more they tend to be militaristic. I mean, just anecdotally, if you look at the major institutions here in the United States, from the educational system to the healthcare system to the media, you name it, what is the most explicitly and potently Christian institution in America? Our military. That's where you find the strongest articulation of Christian values and Christian principles and Christian leaders. So isn't that ironic? Jesus taught peace and turn the other cheek and nonviolence, and yet it is in our most violent of institutions that we find the strongest Christianity. It may be surprising to you, but it's not to me, because I've seen study after study showing that strong correlation between religiosity, militarism, and nationalism. But that's not still explaining much. It's just noticing relationships and correlations. And of course, not all religious people are highly nationalistic or militaristic, and many secular people can be too, but the averages do tell a story. For me, the social psychological research offers a bit more insight as to why, whether we're talking India, whether we're talking South Korea, whether we're talking the United States or Hungary, why strongly religious people are more supportive of authoritarianism. What do we find? A key value for religious people is obedience to authority. For example, when parents are asked, what kind of values do you want to see in your children? What kind of character traits would you like to see develop in your children? And they're given options, all kinds of options. Study after study shows the more religious the parent, the more likely they are to put obedience to authority as a trait or value they want to see exhibited by their children. It's just the opposite. The more secular the parents, if they're atheists, agnostics, obedience to authority tends to go to the bottom of the list. Thinking for oneself tends to be higher. Secular parents are much more interested in seeing their children develop their own thoughts, their own opinions, their own mind, rather than just obeying authority. So there's something about obedience to authority that is a particularly religious value, and there's something about not being obedient to authority that's a secular value. Second, and this is related, but submission is another religious value. It's at the heart of Islam, the second largest religion in the world. But the idea that we are to submit, that we are small, there's something larger than us, something more powerful, more wise, more moral, and really the best thing we can do is submit to its dictates. That orientation is perfect for authoritarianism. The dear leader says, it's not much of a stretch to say, well, the God says this, so we must do it. The king says this, so we must do it. The king's obviously a representative of God on earth. The dear leader, we must follow what the dear leader says as well. So there's that a religious value of obedience to authority and submission that plays into the hands of dictators and tyrants and authoritarians and fascists. And finally, moral outsourcing, right? Overwhelmingly, secular people will say morality is something we develop ourselves, or we inherit it from our bioevolutionary past, or we use our reason to come to conclusions about what is moral or what's not. We go by experience, but ultimately, we decide what is wrong, what is right, what causes suffering, what causes well-being. Whereas religious people will say, we're not able to do that. We're not capable to do that ourselves. All morality must come from another worldly being who creates morality, and we again just simply follow the rules. Well, if you have to rely on an invisible deity to tell you how to live, you're not really doing the heavy lifting of moral reckoning. You're simply obeying orders from an invisible deity. It's moral outsourcing, and again, it lends itself towards fascism and authoritarianism. Another thing you find in social psychology is how people deal with ambiguity. And again, it's just a correlation, but it's quite consistent and strong. When presented with ambiguous situations or ambiguous moral dilemmas or ambiguous scenarios, secular people have a bit more comfort in that zone. It doesn't cause as much anxiety, it doesn't cause as much panic, it doesn't cause as much confusion. And yet, highly religious people find ambiguity, whether it's moral ambiguity or ambiguity about rules or ambiguity about a game or any kind of scenario that the social psychologist can create that establishes an ambiguous situation. Highly religious people find it far more uncomfortable, anxiety-producing, nerve-wracking, and unpleasant. If you think about it, democracy is messy. It's often unclear what the right thing is to do. It often entails compromise. It often entails negotiation. Whereas authoritarianism is, these are the rules, follow them or else. It's a lot like a religious worldview. These are the laws, follow them or else. So I think these are some of the key reasons why strongly religious people tend to feel more comfortable and more supportive of authoritarianism. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, Phil, these are just correlations. They're not necessarily causation. Maybe it's not that highly religious people tend to support fascists because of religion. Maybe it's some third thing. Maybe it has to do with educational attainment. Maybe it has to do with some other aspect in the culture. Maybe it has to do with economics, politics. I think that's a very fair critique and something we always want to keep in mind. So there's two things we can do with that. One is we can try to control for those other variables and see if the correlations are still strong. The second thing we can do is say, oh yeah, it is some third variable. But if that's the case, that suggests strong religiosity isn't all that important. It's less important than someone's educational attainment. It's less important than someone's occupation. It's less important than their marital status. It's less important than their this other cultural engagement that they're involved in. In other words, religion suddenly becomes less of a factor. That may be the case as well, but then it suggests that we don't really need religion all that much if it's all these other factors that are determining the outcomes that we care about. So what's the solution here? I would say one solution is more secular humanism, more humanist values. So for example, rather than moral outsourcing, we need to develop a morality based on empathy and compassion for others and a desire to see the alleviation of suffering in the here and now. Number two, more laws based on reason, rationality, workability, practicality, and outcomes, not on commands from somewhere out in the universe, or beyond, outside of the universe. Focus on improving the world, as I said, in the here and now. That's a truly secular value, rather than waiting for some eternal reward or punishment way back when. And then, of course, finally, one of the greatest values of secular living is critical thinking, not accepting anything on faith, but demanding evidence, demanding solid reasoning, demanding consistency in thinking and logic. I think the more of us that live that kind of a life, the more likely democracy will stay strong and healthy, and the more likely that authoritarianism and authoritarian dictators will not find the masses that they so desperately need in order to do their nastiness. Thank you very much for listening.